Okay, laissez-faire. It's been very successful when it's been employed in the past. Standards of living for workers, although at the time in absolute terms were very poor, they improved quite rapidly. Um, that's why all the countries that were laissez-faire, that practiced liberalism in the 19th century, went on to become the richest, most powerful countries in the world today because of the foundation of limited government, laissez-faire, individual rights. Yeah, and now I'll turn it over to my opponent.
Okay. So from what I'm understanding, what you wanted to, what you want to prove is that the best way for society to be structured in terms of its economic and political spheres is for them to be as separate as possible. So the economic sphere is left entirely alone just to the market and then the market forces to essentially regulate itself.
Yes, I think that's categorized my
Mm-hmm.
position perfectly. Sort of how
Mm-hmm.
Ayn Rand put it, the separation of state and economy.
Okay. Okay. So I'll perhaps begin maybe with a bit of history. Um, since my opponent is arguing on what I would assume is a laissez-faire capitalism, not um, laissez-faire feudalism or laissez-faire socialism or whatever. I'm presuming it's laissez-faire capitalism that you're talking about. Can I just confirm that
Confirmed.
this is what you refer to?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So for me, and I'm basing this statement on Lenin and his book, Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism. Um, there appear to be three major historical phases in the development of capitalism uh, that he identifies. So the first one is this laissez-faire capitalism that my opponent here is referring to. This is the era of free production, of what Marx called the anarchy of production, of all these competing industries, competing independent producers, just out there on the market, producing commodities, producing goods, generating profits, reinvesting these profits back into production to expand or to innovate or to expand or innovate or whatever else they were doing, whether it's some philanthropy or whatever. Um, and this phase is really what I think many would call the golden age of liberal free market capitalism. The government in most places in the world, at least in the West, was particularly laissez-faire. It was I understand maybe it wasn't perfectly laissez-faire in all places. There were obviously tariffs. There were obviously still remnants of government or state institutions that were still not abolished at the time. But the trend was definitely towards a free market, laissez-faire economic system. That was the hegemony at the time, the economic sort of ideological hegemony. Um, Now, what Lenin wrote was this period came to its highest stage, its most, how do I describe it, most pronounced state of the laissez-faire in around the 1860s. And starting from 1873, when a crisis has arrived, a lengthy period of cartelization has begun. So before then, there was almost and I'm citing Lenin here, apex of development of free competition. Monopoly is barely discernible, embryonic stage. Um, However, after 1873, very slowly, this anarchy of production, this just complete laissez-faire, um, of all these different producers started to aggregate into smaller and smaller pools. Um, and we've been beginning to see all around the economies, whether that's France, whether that's Germany, whether that's the UK, whether that's the US, whether that's I presume Russia or any other country that was undergoing industrialization at the time, the number of competitors in the market began shrinking up until around 1900 to 1903. After that crisis, this anarchy of production, this laissez-faire, has by and large disappeared completely, has been replaced by this monopolized, cartelized markets where only a handful or even fewer producers, enormous producers, controlled most of the economy, whether that's steel sectors, whether that's coal mining, whether that's banking, whether that's anything else. Almost all of those activities would have been mediated through one or two cartels, which would control 80 to 90% of the market share. And this era of anarchy was just over, and we haven't returned to it since. So my argument here is, by laissez-faire, do you mean this monopolized market that has emerged as a result of laissez-faire, or do you want to return back to this golden age of the 1850s, 1860s?
Well, I would defend either, um, so long as the condition of limited government was still there. Uh, I would submit that the golden age of laissez-faire capitalism extended more towards a little later than that. You mentioned 1860s. I think, during the Gilded Age, 1880s to 1910, things were still very much the idyllic stage, if you will, what you described as sort of anarchic laissez-faire, where you had all
Mhm.
this competition and standard of livings were increasing very quickly. Wages were going up very fast. Um, now, now, I think it's true to a degree that big business tends to succeed, but I don't think this is because of an abuse of market power or that it's necessarily a negative thing. I think that big business can be a powerful force. The reason why big business tends to succeed is because they can outcompete their competitors. So Walmart can do a much better job than the mom and pop retail stores. They offer lower prices, they offer a greater selection of goods, and they can use their economic power to sort of dictate terms to their suppliers and say, no, you have to supply us this good at this price, or we're going to go elsewhere and you're going to go bankrupt. And that ends up like, yes, they have a lot of power in the marketplace, but that just ends up benefiting consumers, especially the working poor who benefit most from high price or low prices and also one-stop shopping. So I do think we moved away from laissez-faire, not because of some degeneration of the marketplace, but simply because of ideas. I think that history is ultimately the result of ideas, and what happened was simply the idea of laissez-faire and limited capitalism, of limited government, laissez-faire capitalism became unpopular. This was in part because of the rise of socialism, um, in popularity among intellectuals and individuals, as well as just the general public, but also other ideas. At the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, fascism was very popular in certain countries. Obviously, this resulted in Germany and in Italy, fascist countries arising. But it was also popular amongst intellectuals in other countries as well. Although obviously, eventually not so popular, as we saw the result. Um, but then also just the ideology of welfareism, of intervention, the New Deal. So so laissez-faire was replaced, and I don't advocate for what replaced laissez-faire. I'm in favor of laissez-faire, but I don't think it necessarily has a tendency to degrade. I think that if you had limited government, if you just had the market economy, things would work out fine. Competition is not a head count. It doesn't really matter if there's 20 players or five or that. That's not the controlling factor. Is if you have open competition, even you can have a monopoly, you can have a single dominant player. They're still kept in line simply by the threat of competition developing.
Yeah, okay. So my comment first would be that laissez-faire capitalism, as has existed in the 19th century, has been a period perhaps of one of the most rapid developments of the economy. Um, if you look at growth rates in the 19th century, in, for example, the Gilded Age, they featured some of the highest growth um, of, like, let's call it a modern economy, of a modern capitalist economy. However, at the same time, they've also created this proletarian class, which has transitioned society from this feudal um, system of subsistence farmers into what we have today, which is urban working class, urban urbanites, and the city life. So it was very much a period of very rapid, very significant development within decades. However, my concern, or not concern, what I would contest here is that I don't actually think we can go back in history to this laissez-faire period, because I don't actually believe history is uh, created or shaped by ideas. I think what happened was laissez-faire, as it happened, emerged out of this almost. It superseded the sort of very so at the time, early 19th century, late 18th century, um, the extent of government on people's lives was significantly less than it is now. Primarily not due to lack of want, but due to lack of means. Government simply did not have the capacity to govern and regulate people's lives anywhere near the degree that they have now. And so, even in absolutist states, um, what you had was the absolute power of a monarch or a dictator over the political sphere, but over the social sphere, so long as he didn't go against the grain, um, you were almost free to do as you like. This era of totalitarianism doesn't really come into existence until um, the 20th century, when governments finally had the means to intervene in people's lives so much. So laissez-faire appears to be a phenomenon of this lack of government's capacity to actually regulate production in the 1820s and the 1830s. And also due to the fact that at the time it was very profitable. You had this generation of industrial surplus capital, whereby exactly through this process of generating profits, companies would um, generate surpluses, and then these surpluses could be reinvested back into production, back into um, dividends, or into investment. All these things. That period is almost. I would contest in the 2020s that we don't have that anymore. What we have now is complete subsummation of the economy by finance industry, by the banking sector, by different financial institutions, Wall Street, central banks. We don't have, by and large, any. industrial surpluses anymore. They're almost entirely mediated through banks. And so, for that reason alone, I don't think we can go back to laissez faire. Um, I'm not even necessarily arguing here against the markets. I just think, in terms of especially monopoly capital that has emerged, we need the state to come in and effectively collectivize it. But I do want to be clear before I leave it at that. When I mean the state, I'm not in favor of the status quo state. I'm not in favor of the status quo government, because that is to me the exact same thing as this banking financier class, this monopoly capital. To me, they're the same thing. So in some sense, I want to go beyond that. I want to subsume or abolish that and replace it with something else, something that would actually work for the benefit of the people and not for the benefit of the monopoly capitalists. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to clarify what I meant by
It's
state
actually very
intervention.
interesting because I find myself in agreement with around 70 to 80% of what you just said. I agree absolutely. The over financialization of the economy. I mean, investment banking does have some useful purpose, but I think that it's just too much of the economy now. Um, and I wouldn't be surprised if I disagree. I think that history is determined by ideas. I wouldn't be surprised if we can't go back to laissez faire. If you look at governments around the world, the trend has always been towards increased power to regulate, as you said, to intervene. You know, sometimes for good. You build a hospital for poor people. That seems like a pretty good use of government spending. Other times, not so good. You brushed on imperialism briefly. That wasn't really the topic of your remarks, but it's one area where I believe Marxists have done very good work, or at least have pioneered. I don't entirely agree with the causes of imperialism in the Marxist view. I believe that Schumpeter did a greater justice to the topic in his work on imperialism, titled Imperialism, um, whereby um, his view, if I'm stating it correctly, is that the weight of armies themselves sort of dragged the nations to war. It wasn't for economic interests; it was simply having this large military establishment would mean that it got used. But I guess I'm really off topic here, so I wouldn't be surprised if we can't get back to laissez-faire. I think we can theoretically. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't, simply because the trend has been in the opposite direction in every country around the world. Um, but it's certainly what I advocate for. It's what I think. I think it's possible to do. I don't know if it's going to happen. And the way to do it: reduce government spending, reduce regulations, cut taxes.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't necessarily think we can't go to a freer market. I think that is actually something that could be possible. One of the examples that I can quickly point to is, and I know you might disagree, is China. China went from a very heavy-handed state intervention in the economy under Mao in the 1950s and 60s to a mostly, as at least in terms of small businesses, small to even medium businesses, laissez-faire. The Chinese government, as far as I'm aware, does not really regulate or prohibit small business activities, things like street stands, things like small businesses, cafes, all these things. What they're most interested in is what I've described this big industrial big banking, big oil refining, oil or coal, or this sort of industries that would otherwise just end up cartelized and would, as they have in the US, corrupted the government. So they're more interested in regulating that and preventing those from creating conditions for the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party and preventing them from exerting too much undue influence on society. But in terms of the small businesses, I mean, I'd argue it's easier to actually be a small business in China than it is in the US. The amount of red tape, or in Europe, the amount of red tape that you have to go through, the amount of bureaucratic shenanigans, registrations, licenses, all these things that you need just to get like a small business going is much. It's much more difficult to do that here than it is in China. And so in that sense, I do actually think it's possible. And it is actually perhaps even the future to have this sort of small, this sort of laissez-faire for the small guy, for the small business, for the small or even medium business, for the as Marx would call the hard work of the petty artisan. But what I think we can't, and this is perhaps why I qualitatively said, why I mentioned this topic is, in the 1860s, there was no interference in any of the aspects of the economy, whether that's it for the small guy or for the big guy. I think we're at a stage where we can't ignore the big guys, this cartelized market, this because as we've seen, they are in collusion with the government. This has happened everywhere. Governments around, especially with banking. Banking as a whole is not really a laissez-faire industry anymore. First of all, because we have central banks, but as macroeconomic theory at least would suggest, central banks are there to regulate the economy, make sure the recessions are smoothed out. But what we actually see in practice is central banks are political tools of the ruling class to pursue domestic or foreign policy. Two quick examples I can give of is the US is obviously using the dollar as a weapon, as a method of sanctions, as a matter of sanctions primarily, but it's in particular its use of the dollar is definitely political, and so having control over the supply of the dollar through the central bank, it's effectively a political tool. And the other example is obviously Turkey. Erdogan's COVID policy not particularly effective. What he tried to do is he tried to win his. So Turkey had an election this year, so he tried to win his support by preemptively lowering interest rates in order to, as theory would suggest, stimulate the economy, have more economic activity, and therefore give the illusion of growth, which would strengthen his position on the polls. So this idea that the two are separate is complete nonsense, and I view it as an obfuscation. Central banks and banking in general is a tool of the ruling class, the ruling political establishment to reassert its control. And central banks have completely subsumed not just industrial capital, not just the productive capital, but also just commercial banks. There is no independent commercial bank that isn't like connected in some way to a central bank. It's entirely to a degree, it's nationalized to a degree, but it's nationalized for the interests of a very narrow group of people. And so in that sphere, perhaps I think where we might disagree, because for the small guy, I'm all in for it. You know, if you want to start a shop, if you want to start a coffee shop, if you want to start a bar that plays reggae and you can smoke pot or whatever, I'm all in for that. If you have 2 employees, if you have 5 employees, I don't really care. I think overall the socialist movement is um, losing. It's shooting itself in the foot primarily because it's trying to win these moral battles over, whether you can or can't employ 3 or 5 people in your ideal bar that you always wanted to. I think what's most important actually is concentrating on um, this establishment that rules through the banking institutions, that rules through central banks, that rules through regulation and regulatory capture. Um, yeah, that would be my main point. So I guess I want to kind of pivot towards that, towards like the big um, paralyzed markets, because I think for the small guy, I don't think we're going to be disagreeing much.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I agree with you that in some senses, China's become more capitalist than the USA, than North America, than Canada. And not just China. I've spent some time in Latin America and in Asia, and entrepreneurship in general is easier. I think in a lot of countries, for example, I lived in a poor barrio in Cancun, renting a little apartment that cost like $100 a month. It was, there was no hot water, but it was all right. Uh, I mean, you don't mind the cold shower when it's so hot anyway, and and my neighbor had a little chicken store, chicken restaurant in her house, the family house, and that's very common in Latin America and in the Philippines. You've got food vendors on the street. You know, they get a bunch of fruit and they have a little fruit stand. They're not paying any rent. They don't have a business license. They're just selling fruit on the street, and that would be illegal in Canada or the USA, um, because there's regulations that prohibit it. Precisely because, as you say, the government has been captured by corporate interests, powerful economic interests that bend the law to privilege themselves. And I don't disagree with that. I think that absolutely, there's collusion between big business and government, and that's wrong. That's bad. Um, you mentioned the banking sector, and there's a rich history in the United States specifically of powerful banking industries subverting foreign policy to pursue their own agenda. The Rothschilds, the House of Morgan. There's these people literally they had high-ranking officials within the White House that were advising presidents. Uh, well, we've got a lot of assets in Europe. Let's go to war against the Nazis to make sure that all our assets in France and England are secured. I mean, maybe it was a good thing to go to war against the Nazis anyway, but the tremendous power wielded by these banking families because they can get politicians elected, they can influence. Yeah, absolutely, they rig the game in their favor. Bailouts, that transfer of wealth from everybody, from society, from the taxpayer to these ultra rich corporations, which are apparently too big to fail. Well, I disagree with that. I think they should be allowed to fail if they're making stupid loans, if they're taking too many risks. Yes, they deserve to fail. No, there's no auto win in the market. You can't just, oh, what? We're not allowed to fail. We're too big. What? We're too rich to fail. The taxpayer has to bail us out. That's wrong. It's wrong that Joe Schmo has to pay taxes. He's a plumber or he's a whatever. He's working in the trades. He's working at Walmart. He's paying taxes, so some billionaire doesn't take a loss because that's against the rules. No, I mean that's what central banks do. They say that they're staving off economic collapse, but really they're just lining their own pockets at the public's expense. Um, and the banking system as a whole, absolutely, it's rotten to the very core. I'd like to see a return to sound money and to the separation of the warehousing of funds and the functions of warehousing of money and investment banking. Right now, you go to the bank, you put your money in the bank, they lend it out. They're using fractional reserves, so the money's not all there. Uh, I'd like to see a different system where you have a bank, you just put your money in the bank, maybe you pay a fee for them to hold on to it. They're not actually lending it out. Then you've got a separate system of investment banking. Um, but so yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of reform that I'd like to see as well. But the way I approach it is by cutting down on state power, whereas other people say, well, we got to take away the power from the corporations and the businesses. I just take that power away from the state so that they can't, there's no use of power there that way to intervene to pick winners and losers. So it's different. It's the same problem, but different approaches to solving it, I guess.
I think perhaps, yeah. I think um, for me, the way I see it is that first of all, I think when you were referring to the foreign policy of the banks, I think you were referring to World War One, not World War Two. So this is before the Nazi leaks, maybe. As far as I understood, I absolutely agree. That in the US, obviously, bankers have had such an influence on foreign and domestic policy. Um, a lot of times they're engaged in hybrid warfare about in countries where we don't even hear that on the news. I mean, how many people have heard about the war in Yemen? You know, how many people have even know anything about it? But not to pivot away from the point. As you mentioned, the idea of too big to fail is just a cover story for naked robbery of society, for the bank bros, for the banks. Obviously, um, I do remember someone particularly commenting in the Discord about America doesn't give handouts, which obviously is perhaps true, but it's not true for it's true for the average person. It's not true for the big banks and the big corporations, especially the big banks. And I actually think in some ways big corporations would be allowed to fail, but the big banks, no, they will not be allowed to fail no matter what. And I think the reality is that we need to kind of face is that the governments that we have in the West, in the US, but also in Europe, um, they're indistinguishable from the banks. They're indistinguishable from the banking industry, the banking sector, um, the big banks. They're indistinguishable from it. It's one of the same. Our governments are what they are. Is they're the police for the assets of the bankers in foreign countries. They have universities, they have academics who are going to write studies and papers about different reasons and justifications for why we need to have this cartelized banking sector. I don't believe that that is unintentional. For example, the cartelization of the market, as Lenin was describing towards the end of the 19th century, I do think the way what he meant by that, and he clarifies, is through capital accumulation. So this is an informal process. It's not that anyone wills it. It's not that anyone. Obviously, as a producer, you preferably want a bigger share, but this. But what I'm trying to get at is the reason why it led to the cartelization of the market in the 1900s and not in the 1850s is just due to these informal forces of production, right? So it's not that anyone wills it; it's just what is. So where I was going with this is that the subsummation of the economy and government by the banking sector cannot be described as something involuntary. Obviously, centralization of finance has created these bankers, but the subsequent corruption. I'll use the word corruption. Well, I mean it broadly, not just like in terms of giving bribes, but in terms of actually changing the character of the government to its liking. The corruption of government was a deliberate attempt to dismantle this um, anarchic system in order to create a state banking corporate merger. Um, it was the unification of the political class, which perhaps was a distinct class in the 1800s, with the financial class, with the huge industrialist class into one, so that they, by the 20th century, became indistinguishable from one another. Um, which is why I think we might, to some degree, agree that we both want to replace, at the very least, we want to abolish the state as it is now. Now, for me, I think I want to replace it. I think for other people, they may want to just abolish it completely and have nothing in its place. I don't necessarily think that is possible, but for the sake of argument, for the sake of where we are now, I think the abolition of the state as it currently is should be the primary goal of not just libertarians, but I would also argue of socialists. Um, I think um, I think we need to own up to the reality that we have, which is that this distinction doesn't really exist. And um, for the laissez-faire, um, I think it is possible for the small guy, and I think it is something that would actually be desirable by most of the population. I think most people don't want to live in an economy where the government regulates every activity that they have, that looks into every paycheck they get, looks into every transaction they get, looks into every idea of business they have, where it lays down specific, like um I'm not talking about like the very essential questions and regulations, but makes you register everything, and then you need to get approvals, you need to get licenses, you need to get permits, you need to get this and that registration, you need to get this and that approval, and this whole process can take years and is incredibly time consuming, money consuming, and frustrating. I actually think for small industries, for regular people, the economic activities they would engage in, I actually think the government should absolutely be less and should absolutely leave people um, to pursue what they want to pursue. I think it should only step in um, only in situations where it's leading to this cartelization, monopolization of the market, which I don't think will happen with small businesses, with small mom and pop shops. For the most part, they don't really have any method of becoming an industry giant without getting involved with the banking sector, which I mean just goes back to the point, which is that we don't actually live in the same. I don't. I think qualitatively, the arrangement of the economic system is very different than it was in the 1860s when Karl Marx wrote his Das Kapital, that came out in 1867. I think Marx at the time was obviously writing from the perspective of this free producing anarchy of production market where everyone's a competing producer and there isn't really, as Lenin pointed out, the cartels are in their embryonic stage. We're past that stage. That doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. So
I agree
those
that
are my
number one priority is abolish the state as it exists. I would say even before that, or a zeroth priority, is unilateral disarmament. I mean, get rid of the military, because my priority really is the survival of the human race. I think so long as we make it another 100, 200 years, we're going to be fine. But in the meantime, let's not kill each other. So unilateral disarmament's the best approach because that reduces any chance of war, world war. But yeah, absolutely abolish the state, abolish any sort of system of privilege, corporate welfare, transfer of resources from uh, you know the working class, the economic class to privileged political elites and their special interest groups. I do think that there's one issue is that um, production nowadays is very capital intensive. So I don't see how you get to that sort of artisan society that you desire, given that production is so capital intensive. I think you do need to have, for at least some things, large scale enterprise. You got to be able to afford the factories that do all the producing for cars and for whatever. But we're also seeing a shift towards more individual control of employment, more freelancing. And I think, like you mentioned, the economy's a lot different today. Well, I think 50 years from now, it's going to be radically different with the rise of artificial intelligence, if it actually gets there, with continued capital accumulation. So I think that we are going to see a lot more of like freelance workers and people that are doing creative work in charge of their own sphere there. Um, and absolutely, what I want to see, get rid of the state and then have more regional autonomy, so that if you got one area where people want to try socialism, absolutely, that area can be primarily socialist. Little small scale enterprise as well. Maybe some interaction with large scale enterprise outside for big ticket items like cars or whatever that aren't really feasible to produce yourselves, and then organize that region however you want. Another region can do what they want, and have that regional autonomy, and people can decide for themselves what they like best. I personally, it's a goal of mine to have like a little self-sufficient homestead and just raise my chickens and plant my crops, and trade with my neighbors. Absolutely, I would love that life if I could afford, a little homestead. That's hopefully how I'll retire. Uh, um, and yeah, I mean, we gotta get rid of the central banks. We gotta drastically reform banking, remove the financialization from the economy, and change all that. I mean, how we do it, obviously, that's a long series of discussions. But stop the bailouts, stop these special privileges for wealthy investors, reform things in that direction. And you mentioned how corporations might be allowed to fail, but banks wouldn't, and that's just a historical fact. Banks weren't allowed to fail; they would go broke, and then the government would intervene, and they would suspend the issue. They would suspend specie payment, so the banks were in this legal position where they could collect on their debts, but they didn't have to pay out what they owed, which is unheard of. I mean, normally a business would just go bankrupt if they couldn't pay their debts. They couldn't, but the banks were in this special class, and it is a scratch my back, I'll scratch yours situation, because the banks give the politicians the money to fund their election campaigns, which obviously extremely expensive. They've got to buy the ads, they've got to pay all the staff, and the bankers aren't just giving that money away. They get a very handsome return on their investment in the form of legislation that benefits them. Um, you can't just start your own bank. That wouldn't be allowed. It's cartelized. It's an oligarchy. It's a big club. You're not part of it. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'll turn it over to you, and you can finish, and we'll end there.
Yeah, sure. And first of all, I do want to say um, the type of the sort of dream that you've mentioned about having your own homestead and your own animals. I think that's actually really common. If you go and ask a lot of people, sure, A lot want to become millionaires through, Bitcoin or whatever. But what actually people seem to want and derive happiness from is these small, as I would describe them, petty artisan activities, whether it's starting your own restaurant, your own cafeteria, cash cafeteria, whether it's a reggae bar that you want to start, whether it's a skate punk theme park, whether it's a small homestead, whether it's an orchard, whatever it is. A lot of people have these dreams of wanting, independence from both the constraints that they're put in under the economic system that we have, where they want to be self-sufficient, where they want to just be fulfilled with the job that they do at their own little in their own little sphere. And I think trying to argue with people about that, no, you can't do that, is just not. It's not working, right? You don't convince someone that what they want is wrong. What you should do is instead try to talk to people based on what they already want and what already motivates them, and try to find common ground there and see if you can move forward to the state that you want. So I think actually for a lot of people, yeah, obviously, I would want a system in which we can participate in all of that, where you can, if you want, you can start your own homestead, where if I want, I can start my own bar, whether if you want to start your own like theme park, whether if, no, not theme park, skate park or whatever it is, whatever you want to do, I'm not against that. If you're successful and you open two bars, if you have two homesteads, whatever it is, that's still fine. I think I was just quickly checking. I was listening to what you were saying, but I was just quickly checking because if memory serves me right, I do believe the Soviet Union, I don't know if it was before or after Gorbachev, so this is in the late stages, it actually allowed small businesses up to 50 employees. So if you were starting your own thing, you could employ up to 50 people before the government was going to step in and effectively, take that away from you, take that sovereignty away from you. I'm not necessarily here to put numbers. I think this is up to like serious scrutiny and debate. But for small businesses, I genuinely think the government should leave them alone. We should have laissez-faire in terms of that. And for the bigger ones that employ 500, 1,000, there's an element of sociality involved, right? So it's no longer just me having my own bar or me having my own homestead, and like it doesn't affect you. It now all of a sudden a lot of people are involved and a lot of these social forces are involved. So here perhaps some sort of a direction, some sort of benign oversight. And what I mean by benign oversight is if there are abuses of power, then the government could potentially step in here. Although I still think trade unions should mediate that. I think employees should form their own unions and collectively bargain with their employers in that situation. But yeah, for the big industries, I don't have mercy. As you mentioned, there wasn't a time in history where banks were allowed to fail. This is apparent. And yeah, like to me, just a quick closing statement, just like going back to China or putting the spotlight back on China. I think the elegance of Deng's reforms and where China is today is precisely this transcendence beyond what we'd consider ideals in the West. So I think a lot of people, when they look at a country like China, they think in terms of ideals. You had socialism, which is Mao, and then you had capitalism, which is Deng, and Deng won over Mao, so capitalism won over socialism. But if you talk to Chinese people, or even just read what Deng or any of the Chinese leaders were writing about the justifications for the policies they were doing, how they justified it to themselves, to the party, and to the people, there's a smooth continuity. So Deng, in that sense, is radically escaping from this sort of idealized matrix of the left and the right. And he's saying, at least as I understand it, that no, actually, what we want as a country is we still want to control these big industries, these big billionaires, and keep the banks away from governments, so that precisely so that you can have your stand, so that precisely you can have your own businesses, your own homesteads in China. So in that sense, it's like it's authoritarian for a libertarian purpose, right? It's this miniarchy. And I'm not calling China miniarchy, but it would be in the US. It could be this miniarchy, right, where the government is small and doesn't interfere in people's lives, but that government is strong and very firm against banks, against these cartels. So it's like this unity of the opposites, which I think is actually something that a lot of people have trouble grasping with. But yeah, I think we need to abolish the state as it is currently and replace it with something that's actually representative of us and our interests. And as you mentioned, the dreams that we have to, own our own bars and run our own shit, free from this, corporate overreach of this banking overreach, this regulatory overreach, which is unnatural and is holding us back.
All right, very well said. Well, thank you again for participating in this debate. I had a great time. I felt like covered a lot of ground, brought up a lot of great ideas, and yeah, have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you for staying up. I know it's very late where you are.
No, it's only three
So,
thirty p.m. for me. So
ah, yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the chats. I'll see you later.
yeah, hopefully we have another. We'll schedule another debate soon. All right, take care.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Bye.
All right.